Vietnam and the Vietnam Lawyers Association on the organization of this 5th conference. The 4 conferences that have been organized since 2009 have, I think, played an absolutely essential role in opening up the discussions about the South China Sea to a regional and international audience. And the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam and Vietnam Lawyers Association have made a tremendous effort in also documenting and publishing the results of these conferences, both on the web and printed books. And I think that the lineup of speakers at this conference goes even beyond the earlier conferences, and we've seen also how these conferences organized in Vietnam have led to a proliferation of conferences in the region and throughout the world on the South China Sea. So this has become a major topic of discussion internationally. When we deal with these events, it's only natural that we start with CARLYLE THAYER of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences, the University of New South Wales, and the Australian Defence Force Academy, Australia. Whenever I have had any problem in following the recent events, I will consult the latest writings or speeches or talks by CARLYLE THAYER, which are available on the web, and then I will get an analytical overview of what has happened. My only worry now for the talk that we will hear now from CARLYLE THAYER is that his paper covers no less than 5 areas of recent developments, and he has only 12 minutes to get through it. So therefore, please, CARLYLE.
Thank you, Stein. I'd like to begin by thanking the Diplomatic Academy of Vietnam and the Vietnam Lawyers Association for the invitation to address you today.
As he's indicated, 5 areas. I won't go in them. For the interest of time, I won't describe them here, but that's the outline. ASEAN unity throughout the years is the major thrust, political unity on a code of conduct, but not agreement on what the code of conduct should contain. New tensions in China-Philippine relations, the China-Asean consultations on the COC, the role of the major powers, and South China Sea and bilateral relations. So if we look at my first theme, that given the debacle last year at the 45th AAM with no joint statement, we saw Indonesia step up, get agreement on 6 principles, and then produced a 0 draft COC to ASEAN leaders on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly. This has not received formal ASEAN consultation, and my soundings with diplomats and other observers indicates that ASEAN is quite concerned that should it achieve a unity and come up with a draft COC, it could either be rejected out of hand by China or even complicate it. So at the moment, ASEAN has yet to work out a full draft, although Indonesia provided a very important one. Other indications that Cambodia is no longer the chair, and Brunei has played a very strong role, giving it priority, putting the Sultan's prestige on the line and raising it with Chinese leaders. Thailand, as country coordinator, has been very proactive in facilitating these talks. It's backed by the core, your Singapore, Malaysia, Vietnam, and the Philippines. So there is an ASEAN unity by the concerned powers to get an early achievement on the COC. We heard earlier from the Deputy Secretary of ASEAN the quotes of the key phrases that they want formal consultations at a higher level, at the senior official level, with the aim to reach an early conclusion of a COC, and that's repeated at all ASEAN meetings. But more recently, we have the word early harvest, and I'll return to that later. So my summation here is we have a positive trend of ASEAN political unity to consult with China, yes, but not on a final ASEAN draft COC. That remains a work in progress. Now, new tensions in relations between China and the Philippines. Mark Valencia will follow on the politics of the Arbitral Tribunal. I just put out in broad brush here, the chronology in January. Without consulting other ASEAN countries, the Philippines submitted this claim. That produced some tension within, some turbulence within ASEAN itself. The tribunal has been established. Its first session held, and the Philippines has been asked to submit by March 30th a full statement of claims. I don't want to get into that, But as a result of the Philippines doing it, China lobbied ASEAN states to pressure the Philippines to withdraw that claim. And China has adopted wedge politics to isolate the Philippines from other members of ASEAN, and its relations, China's relations with the Philippines have been in cold storage. No high-level visits, no visits by the Chinese foreign minister. And China, according to the Philippines, set the withdrawal of that claim for the unbelievable withdrawal of the invitation, or cancellation of the invitation of the Philippines as the country of honor to host the China-Asean Expo in Nanning this year. And China and the Philippines withdrew its ambassador as a result of that. But that's just on the arbitral tribunal. A much more serious tension arose when China's military and civilian enforcement, and follow-on Professor Sato will be talking about the Chinese paramilitary ships, and their investment, the surrounding of Second Thomas Shoal, located within the Philippines' exclusive economic zones, 106 nautical miles from the shore. The issue there is that in the 1990s, the Philippines beached the BRP, the BARC, Republic of the Philippines, Sierra Madre, and have stationed Marines on that to demonstrate sovereignty, and that occurred just after the Chinese occupation of Mischief Reef. This year, President Aquino instructed the authorities, the military, to shore up that ship because it was rusting and falling apart, and China immediately responded by demanding that the Philippines tow the ship off because it was Chinese territory. When the Philippines ignored that request, China dispatched a warship, a frigate, 2 Coast Guard vessels, and 30 fishing boats to invest, occupy the waters around St. Thomas Shoal and harass Philippine vessels that transit that area. There's some graphic accounts in the Philippines press. China continues to maintain its presence there, and we'll hear from a later speaker elsewhere off the Malaysian coast, now are plundering the resources, the clams, and the living fishes in that area for China in the Philippines' exclusive economic zones. Now, I'm going to use an American football term. The Philippines has twice fumbled the ball this year, and the first fumble comes over Scarborough Shoal, where in quite dramatic fashion and testimony before the Philippine Congress, the Philippine Secretary of Defense indicated aerial photographs revealed 30 and then 75 concrete blocks that had been put in place that were a prelude to China construction activities as it had done in the past. Well, it turns out, result of information, these blocks were in fact placed there by the United States Navy in the 60s when it was using this area as a bombing range, and the blocks were used to shore up the hulls of the targets to make sure there was something still there. And that the 2 parallel posts that I'm talking about that the Philippines also highlighted were part of an abortive attempt to build a lighthouse. At least that's what's being said. Well, the Philippines made these charges. It claimed they were a violation of the Declaration of Conduct of Parties. They threatened to do a diplomatic protest. But up to the present, as far as I can tell, they haven't come clean, that they had made a mistake on this. And the Foreign Secretary merely, and it's not his department that caused this, though, says that the government has yet to determine the facts of the case. So this is a continuing point of confrontation. On to my third point, third major area, ASEAN-China consultations on a code of conduct. I think there's been a change, at least in the atmospherics of Chinese policy, since the formal elevation of Xi Jinping as president and Wang Yi as foreign minister. We saw immediately after the National People's Congress that China indicated to the 19th ASEAN China SOM that it would enter into consultations with on a code of conduct within the framework of the DOC on the basis of consensus. We have meetings of Thailand has sponsored ASEAN-China and Brunei to set up the meeting, which took place in September that we've heard about from the Deputy Secretary. But what must be highlighted is the August 5th press conference that the Chinese Foreign Minister gave here in Hanoi, in which he indicated that countries must have reasonable expectations. There'll be no quick fix. We must have consensus through negotiations. We must eliminate interference, not specified, and adopt a step-by-step approach. Well, I'm terrible at languages, and my translation is the discussions between China and ASEAN will be protracted, if not interminable. as a result of China's wanting to go slow. But nonetheless, the working group has met. It's come up with a work plan, a meeting scheduled for Thailand next year, and it's talking about a work plan next year. It's talking about hotlines. But subsequently, ASEAN has introduced the notion of an early harvest on the COC, and I'm taking that to read, and I need clarification from ASEAN and other diplomats, that as these consultations go on, and once there is an agreement, let's say on search and rescue, that's adopted and implemented immediately and put in the COC basket, and when the consultations are finally finished, all these bits and pieces would be there. Fourth, the major powers, what I'm trying to extract now is their involvement and their contributions or otherwise to tensions in the region. And clearly China sees the U.S.-Philippines relationship as one that is emboldening the Philippines. Well, the Philippines continues to modernize its forces. It's purchasing frigates and jet aircraft. More importantly, it's upgraded its alliance with the United States in a joint vision statement to upgrade their mutual defense treaty. But if the two are acting in collusion, they're also acting apart because these negotiations are stuck. They're stuck on how long should they be. The Americans would like an agreement for 10 years, the Philippines shorter. Philippines only wants temporary access by the United States, rotational presence to military facilities in the Philippines, including the storage. The Philippines wants direct access, and this is the subject of discussion. So there's a current impasse. But nonetheless, the joint vision statement states, and this has relevance for the South China Sea, that the two sides agreed to establish a joint force posture that assures freedom of navigation and provides for common defense of each nation's sovereign territory. So the U.S. slightly edging ahead with the Mutual Defense Treaty. Now, U.S. rebalancing in Vietnam, not in the same category, but in July 25th this year, a joint statement established a comprehensive partnership. I would highlight that in the various clauses was taking note of an agreement, 3 in fact, between Petro-Vietnam and the U.S. Import-Export banks to support trade and investment in Vietnam's petroleum and energy sectors, and agreements reached between ExxonMobil and Petro-Vietnam and Murphy Oil Corporation and Petro-Vietnam. So the United States commercially and private interest are developing, firming up their interest in the South China Sea. Vietnam and the United States held their various defense and foreign affairs dialogues, and I think the important point here is that they've agreed to sign, at the most recent defense, to have cooperation between the Coast Guard of the United States and Vietnam's newly stood up Coast Guard. And this is important because gray-hulled ships, American warships, Navy ships, are inappropriate for this, and in many senses this is a positive development. Also, that Vietnam in August invited the American Secretary of Defense Chuck Hagel to visit next year, and he accepted. Up until this point, starting in 2003, Vietnam and the United States exchanged defense ministers' visits alternately every 3 years. The Vietnamese in 2003, 2009, the U.S. in 2006, 2012. So this seems to break the cycle that means that defense ministers will collaborate more frequently. Turning to China, it has taken multiple efforts during the year to assert its sovereignty. In April, the Philippines reports that it began to deploy its maritime paramilitary ships along a new surveillance patrol route that takes in all the disputed islands and rocks in the South China Sea inside the 9-dash line. And none was more provocative than the deployment in March, April of 4 ships, most modern amphibious, to conduct live landing combat exercises near Mischief Reef, and then to go down to James Shoal off Malaysia and stake a claim. Turning to Japan, it seems to have adopted my words, an enemy of my enemy is my friend. It stepped in, wants to help the Philippines bolster its maritime capacity. It supports its claim to the Arbitral Tribunal and has given a loan for 10 patrol boats. Bilateral relations between the Philippines and Vietnam, and in the interest of time, there was a killing of a Taiwanese crew. This is the second fumble by the Philippines. Instead of immediately investigating it, the Philippines said it was unintentional or was only self-defense. It turns out, again, this was all wrong. Coast Guard personnel fired repeatedly on a Taiwanese boat trying to leave. The President of Taiwan put 4 claims down. Philippines didn't meet them. He imposed sanctions, conducted military exercises, and then the Philippines pushed the restart button. Bottom line is there's a ghost in the room. It's called Taiwan, and we can't ignore it. It is a claimant to the South China Sea, and it is involved, as this case shows, and they're now negotiating a fishery agreement along the line of Japan-Taiwan fishing agreement. In bilateral relations, I can just summarize all this in the interest of time, is that China is now hyping joint development. It calls it, the press, the magic wand of joint development in maritime cooperation. But if we look at the details with Vietnam and Brunei in particular, it only is incremental commercial agreements and looking for Holocene settlements in the Red River and the Pearl River estuary, so very, very little. So I would not say. On the Malaysia case, we have what seemingly is marching to a different drum, a defense minister saying just because you have enemies doesn't mean that your enemies are my enemies, but the clarification is that Malaysia insists that any navy wanting to conduct exercises in the exclusive economic zone should seek permission, and that's not yet the official policy of the Malaysian government to engage in joint development. So let me conclude, and thanks for your indulgence, Chair. ASEAN has a new sense of political unity to enter into consultations, but has yet to finalize its own view of what the COC should be because of fear of Chinese reaction. China has adopted wedge politics to isolate the Philippines while dealing with others. There's a change in Chinese policy, consultations on COT, maritime cooperation, and those should be applauded, but waving the magic wand of joint development is incremental. It's more an aspirational statement. We have the intrusion of power politics by the major power, U.S. rebalancing, Chinese provocative military exercises, and the Japanese provision of patrol boats to the Philippines. Taiwan's role as claimant, as we saw, cannot be ignored. China-Vietnam relations are on a positive upward trajectory. The South China Sea incidents have declined. Malaysia has a hedging strategy. China-Brunei joint development is only a tiny commercial agreement. And finally, China is hyping maritime cooperation and joint development as part of a new charm offensive, and its discussions with ASEAN will be protracted, if not interminable. Thank you.
Thank you, Carl. I thought it was we must be careful with the 12 minutes that we shall not speak too fast. I think that it was good that you showed these conclusions in the end, that we saw there is more ASEAN unity. There is an incredible mess surrounding the Philippines. There is an increasing presence and military engagement by major powers. And also you say in your conclusion that the recent Chinese charm offensive has not brought so much results for China, but more a hype around joint development. We shall now move to KOICHI Sato, Professor of Asian Studies at the JF Oberlin University in Japan. And it's a consolation that you do not have 5 parts like CARLYLE, but you have only 4. And you have also 12 minutes. Please.
Thank you, Chairman. Today's my topic is China's pursuit of marine resources and its maritime law enforcement agencies. China claims South and East China Sea, and because of their claim on marine resources and these marine resources such like oil and gas, also the fishery resources. Their maritime law enforcement agencies dispatch their patrol vessels in South and East China Sea, and they made trouble with neighboring countries' patrol vessels, fishing boats, and oil detection vessels. Why China claims huge amount of the marine resources? Because of the increase in Chinese population, also increase in the per capita GDP in China. China attaches importance on South and East China Sea now. And table 1 shows the fish catch of China. You can understand that there is no increase in the marine catch. And year 2006, quantity of the marine farming reversed the quantity of the marine catch. Table 2 This is a comparison of the Sino-Japanese fishery production in year 2011. You can understand China's biggest portion of the fishery production is freshwater farming, 45%. In Japan, biggest portion is marine fish catch, 80%. So we can guess something wrong about China's coastal area, also the near sea, maybe polluted. China Ocean Development Report, this is Chinese report, supports our guess. There is a sedimentation of cadmium, copper, petroleum, oil waste, arsenic, DDT, PCB on the seabed of the Chinese coastal areas. Evidence suggests that marine and river pollution are the cause of decrease in the fish catch rates in the near sea, and thereby for their expansion of the fishing areas. So they deployed their fishing boat to outer sea. But no numerical data is published. So we can't know how it is serious. Next theme is oil and gas. Table C shows China national offshore oil companies, offshore oil and gas production. In year 2011, BOE, barrel of equivalent, including oil and gas, 331.8 million barrels. China's offshore oil production breakdown is here. Bohai Sea, 66%, but most of the Bohai Sea area is already developed. South China Sea, 33%. East China Sea is quite marginal. The offshore oil and gas production in year 2010 was some 10% of China's oil consumption. So maybe South China Sea's portion is 3% of the Chinese consumption. China expects abundant oil resource in the South China Sea. And a Chinese estimation was say that the South China Sea's oil deposit is 220,000 million barrels. Those U.S. estimation are 3 to 13% of these of Chinese. We cannot know Chinese estimation is true or not. And oil detection. Almost all of the oil and gas fields are located in shallow places, such like sedimentary basin, and that are connected to the mouth of rivers, such like Pearl rivers, also the Red River. Red River is a part of the Gulf of Tonkin. And not the deep and central sea area of the South China Sea, such like Spratly Islands. The Chinese oil company currently published that they finally acquired deep sea oil detection technology in year 2012, so that their drilling rig could reach 3,000 meters in depth. Now they may know their estimation is true or not. Next topic is an overview of the Chinese maritime law enforcement agencies. The tasks of Chinese maritime law enforcement agencies are to protect Chinese maritime security, sovereignty, and relevant interests, fisheries, and oil and gas. Many people say there are 5 dragons, but from the report of the Chinese source, maybe more than 11 government agencies are in charge of maritime affairs. But bigger one is 5. Ministry of Land and Resources, State Oceanic Administration, SOA, China Marine Surveillance, CMS, Ministry of Agriculture, Fishery Law Enforcement Command, FLEC, Ministry of Transport, Marine Safety Administration, MSA, Ministry of Public Security, Border Control Department, BCD, and Customs Office. Here is some photos taken by Japan Coast Guard. This is CMS, this is FLEC, this is MSA. We can't know the details of the Chinese Maritime Law Enforcement Agencies' tasks. And I checked the several Chinese documents, how they are separate, how they are coordinate each other. And here is a comparison table of the Chinese Maritime Law Enforcement Agency's tasks. You can understand many fields are overlapped. And actually, Chinese government recognized this situation. And early this year, they had begun the restructure of State Oceanic Administration and nominated the Public Security Vice Minister as the chief of the newly established Bureau of China Coast Guard, CCG. The CMS, FLEC, and Customs were merged into the CCG under the SOA. So, four of them, CMS, FLEC, Customs, also the BCD are in the SOAs. Also, they repainted the patrol vessels from this July. They repainted CMS to CCG, FLEC to CCG. And how they deployed in South and East China Sea. Actually, most of the patrols belonging to Chinese maritime law enforcement agencies in the blue waters have been conducted by CMS and the FLEC, because the BCD, Customs, and the MSA have owned only a small number of patrol vessels weighing more than 1,000 tons. Some CMS and FLEC patrol vessels escorted the Chinese fishing boat in the South China Sea and made trouble with ASEAN Coast Guard agencies, oil detection vessels, and their fishing boats. And how they deployed? Deployment in South China Sea. I counted the bow numbers. Sea area surrounding the parcel, 39. This is the biggest figure. Because at the parcel, they have a station for FLEC. And sea area surrounding Spratly, 21. Sea area surrounding Scarborough Shoal, 18. Sea area surrounding Pratas, 2, and so on. Deployment in the East China Sea is East China Sea surrounding Senkaku Island, 21 vessels are there. But this is not the small number. The same vessel repeatedly enter the foreign waters. So in case of Japan, I counted the Chinese patrol boat enters Japanese contiguous zone, also the territorial waters, in this 1 year, 1,055 times. So maybe same things has happened in South China Sea. And the total bow number of deploying Chinese patrol vessels in South and East China Sea is some 80s. And 3/4 of them are concentrated in South China Sea. 1/4 is concentrated in Senkaku, seas area surrounding Senkaku Islands. And currently, some Chinese and ASEAN scholars, my friends, told to me, Chinese government considers ASEAN members as rather easy to communicate with and handle. So it is possible that Chinese government will attach more importance on maritime confrontation with Japan. This prospect sounds like a grim story for Japan. But the total number of the Chinese fishing boat is astronomical. Total number of the fishing boat of the provinces facing South China Sea, such as Fujian, Guangdong, Hainan, Guangxi, is about 180,000. And if the CCG vessels concentrate their offensive on the East China Sea, many Chinese fishing boats in the South China Sea will be captured by the maritime law enforcement agencies of ASEAN countries. Also, Japan Coast Guard has 117 patrol vessels. And it was said that China is now stressing shipbuilding, also reinforcement of the CCG. I can predict if China increases the number of the patrol boats, Japan and ASEAN countries will follow suit, and it will raise the risk of the armed clashes between China and others at the seas. This is a typical security dilemma. We should recall the successful Asian Maritime Security Cooperation for the Information Sharing Center of the Regional Cooperation Agreement on Combating Piracy and Armed Robbery Against Ships in Asia. Let's stop the unproductive conflicts. Actually, this photo, 3 of us is Japanese, but photo was taken by Chinese friends. They are quite amicable, also cooperative. So, sorry. So, okay. So if the indiscriminate fishing and marine pollution continues, the South and East China Sea will be the Dead Seas. So if China stops the offensive against ASEAN claimants and Japan and began to cooperate activity described in DOC, in that case, Japan and other external dialogue partners can extend technical and financial assistance to China and ASEAN. We have a long experience of struggling with marine pollution. We can contribute to the mitigation of the Chinese marine pollution and development of the marine farming. Let's maintain peaceful and fertile sea for future generations of the East Asia. Thank you very much.
So, thank you, Koichi Sato, for pointing out a basic dilemma when it comes to fish and maritime surveillance. You have pointed out that there is a proliferation of maritime surveillance vessels and Coast Guard vessels. They are strongly needed for the purpose of protecting the fish stocks and the environment, both in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. But instead they may be used for unproductive purposes in fighting between the nations, so that fishing vessels and maritime surveillance vessels are used in a kind of dangerous conflict scenario, which is both dangerous because it can provoke direct conflict, and dangerous because it will fail to protect the fish stocks, so that the South China Sea can end up like a Dead Sea. This is one worry. When I have listened more recently, both here at the conferences in Hanoi and also at other conferences, to Mark Valencia, he has often been strongly worried about the military developments in the region and how the local countries become victims of great power games. But today he will speak about a legal squabble, the one between the Philippines and China over the Arbitral Tribunal. So please, Mark, now you have your 12 minutes.
Does that, thanks, Stein. Does that count walking to the podium in the 12 minutes? I'm really, really happy to be here, safe inside the hotel with the typhoon raging outside, at least in central Vietnam. I'm proud to say that I've attended 4 of the 5 conferences that have been organized by the host agencies. That's an 800 batting average for those of you who follow baseball. I appreciate the invitation to be here again from DAV and the Vietnam Lawyers Association, and I hope I get invited back. Well, we'll see, depending on the paper, perhaps. Well, Stein introduced the paper as talking about the legal aspects. That's not really so. I'm going to talk about the politics of the legal case or the arbitration, how it got there and what its implications are. Well, first of all, we all have to face the fact that there's an ideal world that we all, perhaps, or many of us, aspire to see and bring to fruition. And then there's the real world. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit. I'm also going to talk about the regional political context that that this arbitration is taking place in. It's not taking place in a political vacuum, as much as we would like that to be. And then I want to talk about the range of possible outcomes and their implications. Well, first of all, in an ideal world, of course, this case would be decided simply on the law and the facts. The countries would accept the verdict and move on in their relations. But this is a real world. And this is not to imply that the arbiters will be influenced by politics per se. However, their legal philosophy and worldview will come into play. But more importantly, what they do decide will have serious implications for the dispute settlement process and for peace and stability in the South China Sea. Well, the political context, it's true. I mean, Stein has heard some of this before, maybe some of you have. It hasn't gone away. There is a contest going on, as much as some may want to try to deny it. There is a clash of titans. The political tectonic plates are shifting. The U.S. represents the superpower of today and the status quo power. China represents the power of tomorrow, and its rise is causing friction in the world political system. This is just a fact of life. Now, more specifically, China and the U.S. are in a competition, maybe even a conflict, in a slow-moving behind the scenes for the hearts and minds of Southeast Asia. Carl talked about ASEAN unity. Others are going to talk about it as well. I don't think that ASEAN unity is something that you turn off and on like a faucet. I think it's a long-term struggle. And I think this South China Sea case could be a tipping point for it or against it. There are several alternative futures for ASEAN. One is, as Carl outlined, that a robust binding code of conduct is agreed, that perhaps joint development, the magic wand, if they can ever agree on what it is and where it is and how it is, moves on, and there is a peaceful and somewhat stable process and environment. On the other hand, there is certainly the possibility, and there are some initial signs of this, that some of ASEAN will lean towards the U.S. and some of ASEAN will lean towards China, and that this gap will increase and become more manifest within ASEAN and ASEAN deliberations. Some ASEAN countries may fall within the grip of one or the other. One could argue that some ASEAN countries are already in the grip of, say, the United States. After all, the Philippines is a military ally. One can see certain countries, I'll let them speak for themselves, but who have been sitting on the fence and are now getting pushed and pulled off of that fence. There are those who are hedging. However, there is a growing sense of insecurity. Obama's failure to make the trip, Kerry's failure to visit the Philippines this year, this year, this has raised questions in back rooms as to how strong and how enduring is the U.S. commitment. Oh yes, we can say it is, and will say it is. That's U.S. government policy. But in reality, ASEANs are questioning it. The organization as a whole faces a difficult balancing act, and I think ASEAN is facing possible disunity as over time as this situation deepens. Now, as I said, the Philippines is a U.S. ally. It has tacit U.S. backing for its claims and for its complaint. Each ASEAN country has its own national interests and their international relations trajectory. And maintaining unity is going to be difficult. Japan, Carl was polite, said it's gotten involved in various ways. I would say it's stirring the pot. I would say with the encouragement of the U.S. Australia, as you may have noticed, is getting dragged in as well. There's a huge debate going on in Australia at the moment as to what its policy is vis-a-vis China and the South China Sea. Currently, they've made a statement which has really angered, the joint statement between the U.S., Japan, and Australia has really angered China, who responded with a butt out, basically, and diplomatese. All right, the president of ITLOS has set up an arbitration panel. The case is complicated, it's confusing, and it's even possibly dangerous. Dangerous because the decision could show that the emperor has no clothes, that the enforcement does not exist, the compliance does not exist with the settlement mechanism, or it is possible that by a pure decision, one all or nothing, that like Samson, the tribunal or the arbitration panel may pull the temple down upon itself. The possible outcomes. One is that there is no jurisdiction of the ITLOS, that the complaint is not well-founded in fact or law and is an abusive process. If this were to be the decision, then there would be those who would crow that international law favors big powers, the Yale School, as it were, the Myers-McDougall, that law is the arms of politics. Other claimants will then have to negotiate with China, and that's going to be a long, hard road. More Southeast Asian countries will lean towards the U.S. to protect themselves, and worse, other historic claims may surface here and around the world. The Philippines has made noises about bringing the Sabah claim to international arbitration. That would be wonderful for ASEAN unity, and that's being facetious. The panel, another second option is the panel does have jurisdiction and rules against China's 9-line claim. It's clear China will not abide by the ruling. The political uncertainty and tension will prevail in the South China Sea. There will be more and more intense incidents. The dispute settlement mechanism within the UNCLOS will be shown to have no power. Russia's recent rejection of its jurisdiction in the Greenpeace case adds to this complication. And in the U.S., there would be an effect that sort of emboldened the opponents of UNCLOS who would say, look, if we ratify, this could happen to us. We could get dragged in and embarrassed. Of course, there is wonderful precedents that were shown by the U.S. in the Nicaragua case before the ICJ. The U.S. did fight jurisdiction. It lost. When it lost, it withdrew. And when the penalty or the decision went against the U.S., the U.S. refused to comply with it, and it even blocked compensation ordered by the court in the Security Council as one of the 5 perm members. An interesting aspect of that case was that the court found that the U.S. was not, had violated the idea of peaceful maritime navigation, something that the U.S. is pushing right now as a ploy in the South China Sea. Finally, you could have a compromise or split decision. Do these things happen? Absolutely. With the ICJ, the Horsberg Light case, that was clearly a compromise where some was given to one and something was given to another. And the case bubbles on and may for our lifetimes. The compromise could be something along the way that the 9-line doesn't fly, but that China somehow has a historic title and thus a right to access to the resources within the 9-line, but it must share with other claimants. This would mean back to the negotiating table and possibly joint development. Other possibilities, of course, the 2 sides could reach settlement involving joint development. They could perhaps try to keep it quiet, or the details, such as the Brunei-Malaysia agreement. I'll let the Malaysians speak for themselves, but that has been kept from their citizenry, the details of what happened there. Or China could clarify its claim to say that the line only indicates sovereignty over the legal islands within it, and that it claims shells and EEZs from those islands, and therefore draws a median line between those islands and the mainland of other littoral countries. Now, of course, those countries would scream bloody murder. They would say this is unfair. But after all, they have been saying they want China to comply with UNCLOS. This would be complying with UNCLOS. And the trick is that China could not be forced into arbitration because this is about a boundary, and boundaries are outside the jurisdiction of ITLOS. So then China might piece by piece, offer joint development in certain areas again. The details are in the pudding. I should mention about the ASEAN uniting to push China to sign a COC. This is true, and this is a step forward. But the devil is in the details. And if you look at some of the details, it's going to be hard to get agreement even among ASEAN, let alone between ASEAN and China. So, in the end, I think that this case may be a test case. And we have to ask the question whether this will be the sunrise or the sunset on the peaceful settlement of maritime disputes in the South China Sea and elsewhere. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark Valencia, for this extremely useful overview of the possible outcomes of the arbitral tribunal. Your two first options seem to be the most negative. The third outcome, with a kind of intermediate result that could perhaps be acceptable in some way to China, looked better. But it's clear that the preferred outcome, I think, from your point of view, is the fourth, where there is a settlement that leads the Philippines and China to withdraw, the Philippines to withdraw the case. That can happen at any point until the arbitral tribunal has its say. And this would then perhaps be based on China doing something that you just recently advised China to do in an article in South China Morning Post, and that is to define the U-shaped line as meaning only a claim to the islands and their maritime zones. If China does that, it moves on to a legal language that would, in a way, make this arbitral tribunal unnecessary. It's the same question of the arbitral tribunal will also be touched upon, at least in the paper of Mr. Christoph Eck. It's with great expectation that I now look forward to your presentation. I have not heard you before, but I've often been missing people like you at conferences about the South China Sea, people who know about oil. I come from an oil-producing country, an oil-exporting country. What we did in Norway was that we agreed on the maritime boundaries with the United Kingdom and with Denmark before we started exploring for real. And then everything had been resolved before we took out the value. Also, in our negotiations with Russia, we always insisted that we shall not prospect for oil, no seismic, nothing, until we have agreed. And it took 30 years, and then we could start after the agreement had been made. But here in this region, I often hear people with wild expectations for all the oil that can be found, and with the kind of expectation that it's possible to take out the oil with force or with power. But when you hear oil people speak about it, you get a more realistic understanding. Now, Mr. Christoph Eck, you specialize in mergers and acquisitions, and you have a lot of experience from the oil business, also from cross-border deals. So now we'll listen to you. Please.
Thank you. So I'm very happy to be back in Hanoi, where I not started but had very intensive activities in the early 90s, where there was no South Asian Sea workshop at that time, though the tension in South China Sea was already existing. I must start, before going into the core of the object of my speech, and oil and gas development and the consequences of oil and gas development due to the South Asia Sea disputes. I would like to say a few introductory words about South Asia Sea, because we've seen today discussions, and we'll see over the two days. I went through the papers, very interesting discussions. But what I want to stress is that, and it's been showed recently, South Asia Sea is on the agenda and getting a lot of attention all over the world. A lot of changes have been seen in Europe about this issue, and not only for oil and gas reasons, but because it's sort of a landmark issue. South Asia is, and including China, is a major economical region for the rest of the world. It's a major also political region for the rest of the world, and it's dragging attention from the whole world. We've been speaking about America, the States, and how the states are involved in Southeast Asia Sea. But anytime a country visits South Asia, anytime a country from South Asia comes to Europe, there is a press release which covers the issue of South Asia Sea. So why is it so? It's because of the rebalancing of the world economy. It's also because South Asia Sea is not only a question of boundaries, nationalism, sovereignty over a piece of water and land. It's also because it's, in terms of maritime routes, very important. Statistics are difficult to assess because there's not someone in the sea counting the boats and the volume of traffic, but experts say it's a third of the world maritime traffic. Resources, of course, of the sea are important. Professor Sato spoke about fish. Oil and gas, I'll say a few words about oil and gas. And today, the increasing tension and coming disputes and all natures of conflicts in the region are dragging, as I said, attention from all over. EU made a statement recently saying that the problems in the South China Sea should be resolved by peaceful means, applying international recognized conventions and well-known rules. Nobody should try to impose its views. Military threats should be avoided. And the latest communique from the EU said that the claimant should try to resolve the issue by using peaceful means available under international law, and in particular respecting their existing legal obligation under UN conventions. Another issue which is also important when we speak about oil and gas, because it's one of the major countries in the world in oil and gas, but also because of its importance, and it was already mentioned by previous speaker, is the re-emerging interest of the US in the Asia. This is not only due to the fact that Asia has oil and gas and that China is becoming a more and more important presence in terms of army, economical and political willingness. It's because America has always been a quite important country in terms of maritime position in the world, and especially in Southeast Asia. It's also a geopolitical issue because we've seen it in Europe, we've seen it in Africa, we've seen it in Eastern Europe. Focus in the States is now more and more on emerging markets and especially Southeast Asia. Europe is important, but is less politically in the radar of the States. We've seen it, and it's been mentioned, and it will be mentioned during the 2 days, a lot of treaties, conventions, agreements, cooperation agreements have been signed recently by the US with regional countries. Same with India, same with Europe. For the oil and gas industry, what is important is to maintain security and avoid increasing active and disputed activities in the seas. Oil and gas activities. So you said when introducing my speech that based on the experience of Norway, oil and gas industries could have some experience and could give maybe some ideas to the politicians or to discussing the issue of South Asia Sea. Already in the region, if you look at the oil and gas activity in the region, the oil and gas activity in the region has an history of joint development and joint ventures. Oil and gas has been discovered in South Asia Sea for decades. It's been exploited for decades, but mainly in undisputed countries. Though it was undisputed countries, we have seen Asian countries developing those blocks and those resources, either with other countries, regional countries, and with a lot of other joint ventures with major oil and gas companies. We've seen in Vietnam, Russia first, for obvious reasons. We've seen all the majors, Exxon, Shell, Mobil, French Total, Italian companies like Eni, Indian companies. So there is clearly today a historical trend of joint and development in the region. What is new? What is to be stressed is that, first of all, as it was mentioned by Professor Sato, we don't exactly know what the reserve of the South Asian Sea is. It goes without saying, and I'm pushing open doors, that we never know exactly what the reserves are until we have finished exploiting the reserves. Figures from different agencies varies from 1 to 2, 1 to 3, 1 to 5. Chinese give more important figures. But this is not surprising, because we've seen over the past that it's very complicated to assess the exact reserve of blocks in sea, especially with the current situation, because exploration has been slow. And we were speaking, you were speaking a few minutes ago, Professor Sato, of China buying and having the expertise to 3,000 meters research, which is very deep. So the oil and gas industry has shown its capacity to work with others and to work with but this is not specific, because you mentioned it for Norway. This is not specific to South Asia Sea, because it's been always the case in the history of oil and gas development. Because of the cost, because of the complexity, very often the oil and gas industry have joined forces to develop blocks. This is the case in South America, this is the case in Africa. So what can be learned from this experience? I would say a few words in a minute about what can be learned, but the consequences of, because it's the topic of the 2 days, it's the consequences of the tension and the dispute in South Asia Sea. For oil and gas industry, it's very simple. Oil and gas industry, though they are not totally risk adverse, and we've seen that in several countries in the Gulf and Persian Gulf. They need at least some sort of stability and some sort of certainty. Here we are facing an issue which is a real problem for oil and gas industry. It's the question of sovereignty. You said that before exploiting the reserves you had in Norway, you solved the issue of sovereignty, or at least you find issues to how to develop without and putting aside, and definitely solving the tensions or potential tensions with surrounding countries like England, Denmark, and Russia. For an oil and gas company investing billions in a block on exploitation and research, sovereignty is key. We need to receive and have potentially uncontested permits. And one of the big questions is, I've identified an area or a block which could be of interest. Whom do I speak to? I'm going to start speaking with Vietnamese, and the Chinese are going to say, it's not Vietnamese, it's Chinese. And the Philippines are not going to say, no, it's mine. So it's a situation which clearly will prevent further developments in South China Sea. Which is very unfortunate based on the potential of the sea in terms of oil and gas, though it's, as I said, it's not the Persian Gulf. There are limited resources, but which are of interest, seeing the increasing consumption of oil and gas and the needs of oil and gas in the region. There are also China has announced that due to pollution and environmental issues, they want to shift from coal to gas, and they desperately need gas. We've seen them very active in other regions like Africa. And the consequences is we've seen recently some countries offering blocks to oil and gas industry to bid. And in June 2012, China has offered 9 block deals for exploration in an area located within the 200 miles exclusive economic zones of Viet Nam. And the bid was unsuccessful, as no bidders came to offer to develop the blocks. So it shows that the depending situation in the region is not sustainable for the oil and gas industry. People will not come and develop, except if there are some pre-agreements, sort of pre-agreements or joint developments between disputing countries, but nobody will come. I spoke about the oil and gas reserves. I will, short of time, so I will probably finish on the potential solutions. But you, in the introduction, when you were presenting me, you mentioned solutions. The solutions are, we know that the definite solution and the definite South China Sea dispute regarding the sovereignty and the ownership of the islands and the region will be not solved overnight. Discussions have been taking years and years to reach a declaration on a code of conduct. It's been pending for 10 years. We are still discussing about how to further discuss the definitive and the code of conduct. I guess that it will be taking years and years to finalize it. So what is important for the oil and gas industry? I think physical tension and threats, military threats from especially China has to stop. Joint developments has to be assessed. When I speak of joint developments, it's joint discussions, as there are currently some which are taking place and starting with Vietnam, who set up joint working groups to assess possibilities to develop exploration and production in disputed areas. How to do it, it's also very important for oil and gas industry to have a legal background which is known and predictable, so it should be done following definitions of a UN convention and known legal background, not trying to impose a statu quo or a policy of fait accompli like China is trying to do. And it's clear to finalize and to finish my speech, but I'm open to questions, is to say that oil and gas industry is keen to develop South China Sea, but today is in a tricky position because the politicians and the nations in the South China Sea are not giving them the tools to go and do business. Thank you.
Thank you, Christophe. We now have a little over 47 minutes for questions and discussion, and it will be open both to questions from the audience and from the members of the panel. When you ask for the floor, the distance from here to you is pretty long, so I don't think that my eyesight allows me to read your names. So I will simply point out those who take the floor, and you must then introduce yourself. So now, please, who's out first? If you are building up the courage to take the floor, then I will ask the first question. I will build on something that is in Christophe Eck's paper. And that is related to what Mark Valencia was talking about. And it will probably come up also on legal panels later, and this is about the third parties' interests in the arbitral tribunal. That could also be an interesting question from a political point of view, Mark. What Christoph says in his paper is that other claimant parties than the Philippines and China cannot behave as if nothing has happened. Other countries should consider the option of intervention in this arbitration or filing separate legal proceedings seriously in order to protect and preserve their own interests of legal nature, which may be affected by any decision in this case. If they do nothing, it would be tantamount to giving up and surrendering their legal rights and interests to their competing parties in any legal proceedings in the future. The interested third parties should seek legal grounds for any potential intervention in this case. This is what you wrote in your paper.
Yes, I didn't elaborate about it because it's already mentioned by Mark and other workshops. Speakers will speak about it, but it's true that well, as Mark said, the Philippine arbitration is a sort of good news, because when you're in a private activity, we understand that politicians and countries have to speak, and it takes a long time because it's a very complex issue. It's not because there's no willingness and bad faith, it's a very complex issue. But the Philippine arbitration is good news because it will force people to consider it and to speed up some process and probably force the other countries in the region to either join the arbitration or try to find a solution, because there's nothing worse, and Mark said it with the implications of the outcome, but now people have to be specific and put their cards on the table and elaborate about their merits.
Because I think this is probably something that is actively being discussed now in the foreign ministries of Malaysia, Brunei and Vietnam. Will this arbitral tribunal come up with something that could prejudice our interests? And there you have in the request from the Philippines, you have some aspects of it that have to do with sovereign rights, where the Philippines claims that this belongs to our continental shelf. And if the arbitral tribunal should give the Philippines right on that score, which I find unlikely, then that would engage other countries' interests, because they also have overlapping claims, both to the islands and to maritime zones. But other aspects that perhaps the arbitral tribunal would be more likely to say something about are more in a common interest among the ASEAN claimants, and that has to do simply with the legal status of the submerged features and the legal status of either rocks or islands. And since Malaysia, Vietnam, Brunei and the Philippines seem to hold the same view on this question, I would suggest that a decision by the arbitral tribunal here would not engage their interest in any negative way, so that a wait-and-see attitude could be pretty wise. What would CARLYLE and Mark say to that?
Well, first of all, it's my understanding that when the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi came here, he lobbied the Vietnamese, pressured them not to take any action before the arbitral tribunal. And my understanding is that Vietnam's reply was, well, sorry, they couldn't comply, because if any of Vietnam's interests were touched upon by the tribunal, that Vietnam would reserve the right to make its own legal intervention. So already I think that if my information is correct, that Vietnam has already begun to anticipate this.
Well, I don't have much to add. I mean, I think that's a useful addition, and if I revise the paper, I'll try to add something in. Well, Carl spoke about Vietnam. I don't know that information, and that's good to hear. Maybe we can hear from the Vietnamese as to what their view is. Up till now, they've decided not to go that route, and they seem to think that they can work something out with China. But you're right, it's going to have serious implications for them, I mean, depending on what they decide. Malaysia Well, again, the Malaysians are here, so we should hear from them. The defense minister made some rather interesting statements, which were corrected sub rosa by others. Malaysia had a very bad experience with the Batu Putih case. It shook the government, caused some internal infighting and resignations, and I don't think you're going to see Malaysia going to the international arbitration of anything in the near future.
Okay, then please down in the corner, and remember to introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Leszek Buszyński. I'm from the Australian National University. I was very interested to learn from Mark Valencia that Australia is being dragged into this dispute. But my question today will not be about Australia. In conferences such as these, we get much description of activities, which is very useful and very important. But I think that this is only a start. I would like to ask our panel here about China. What does China want in the South China Sea? What is the link between the description that we have heard in the PowerPoint slides and policy and motive? I'd like to hear your response to that.
So what does China want in the South China Sea? May I suggest that we take the next question first, because this comes from a Chinese participant, and then we can hear the panel's view. So please remember to introduce yourself, Wang Dong.
Thank you, Stein. I'm glad that you recognize me. Actually, I'm not sure whether I'm supposed to answer the question from that gentleman or not, but I do have a question regarding the Professor Sato's presentation. I thought the title of our conference is South China Sea, not East China Sea, but since Professor Sato has brought up this issue, I feel like I wanted to make a very brief comments here. First of all, I would say Professor Sato's accusation against China, I think is groundless, and it is unilateral Japanese position, and I think China will not accept that. Number two, Professor Sato worries that China will settle scores with some ASEAN claimants and then concentrate on dealing with with Japan. I can assure you, Professor Sato, we are not that mean. I think China is not advocating strategic rivalry or confrontation with any country, including Japan. Indeed, Chinese leaders have proposed the shelving disputes and try to find diplomatic solutions to the Taoyuan Island disputes. It is the Japanese stumbling refusal that really becomes the stumbling block to finding a diplomatic solution to these disputes. And I should say that the shelving disputes, it is consensus reached between the elder generations of Chinese and Japanese leaders. And now the Japanese government is saying, oh, we look at the archives and didn't find any document about that. I think this is simply playing with words, because it is an agreement that was not signed into the joint documents and treaty, but actually it was a consensus reached between the elder generations of leaders. So I think, and fortunately, I think there are witnesses of that part of history in Japan who are courageous enough now to speak out to restore that historical truth. And I also would like to refer you to an editorial published by the largest newspaper in Japan, the Yomiuri Shimbun, on May 31st, 1979, and which makes very clear, I can read the quote here, quote, the issue regarding Senkaku sovereignty appeared in the 1972 normalization of China-Japan diplomatic relations, and again in the 1978 signing of the China-Japan Treaty of Friendship. Both governments agreed that while both sides make their sovereignty claim, acknowledge the existence of a dispute, will leave this issue to the next generation to resolve. Although this has not been written into the joint statement and treaty, but this indeed is a commitment between the two governments. Since there is such a commitment, it should be abided by, end quote. So I think it's very clear that the root cause of the current tension in the Diaoyu Island disputes. And my last words, I want to emphasize that the Diaoyu Senkaku dispute is not and should not be the whole picture of China-Japan relations. And I really encourage the Japanese leaders to seize the confrontation on one side and reciprocate the Chinese leaders' call for shelving disputes and trying to find a diplomatic solution to these disputes. Thank you.
So we have got two questions. What does China want in the South China Sea? And then we also got some reactions to Professor Sato, which were mainly about the East China Sea, which is not the main subject of this conference. So your answers to that should be kept relatively short, I think. So perhaps I could ask the panel to comment briefly on what you think China wants in the South China Sea. And where we start with Mark, and then Carl, and then Christophe, and then we take you, Professor Sato, where you also give a brief answer to this, and in the end I will offer some comments on this myself.
Well, for me, I mean, my interpretation, I've been spending quite a bit of time in China recently. China wants recognition of its dominant role in the region, respect and deference, at least on a par with the U.S. Now, how that translates specifically for the South China Sea is yet to be determined. As I said, there could be a number of compromises, possible compromises worked out. So it doesn't have to be a hard, fast, 9-dash line or nothing, or all. I mean, all or nothing. But what it wants is fairly obvious. Are the Southeast Asian countries prepared to yield it, so to speak, to make room for it? Is the U.S. prepared to make room for it? This is the abiding political question of our time.
And then, Carl?
Yes, Les, it's nice to say that those of us who talk about recent developments don't get up to the strategic level, but we stick to our writ. But anyway, I wrote these down before Mark spoke. One, you cannot really just focus on the South China Sea. Strategically, the South China Sea is a southern flank by which American military forces could deploy in a Taiwan contingency. So the most important Chinese interest is to secure that flank, a Navy base on Hainan Island, and its nuclear deterrent force against mainland United States. So that's the first one. It wants a security of its sea lines of communication that extends through the South China Sea onto the Gulf of Aden, not to be able to be disrupted by, in times of crisis. It wants to reset the security arrangements along lines that was suggested by Mark. I put it wants recognition of its historical role of China. And that means that it wants to depreciate but not expel, but depreciate U.S. alliance arrangements and anti-China coalition that work against it. Finally, there's not one China. I'm talking about the national government. There are many Chinas and provincial actors that make this analysis much more complex. They do their own things, as we're going to hear in a later paper at all. So we should take that provincial interest involved in the oil, sea, and gas resources in the region. And finally, they want a compliant ASEAN that respects China's role and its core interest and gives it support and not opposes China. And we can see this quite bilaterally, very, very strong, and at the larger level in the comprehensive strategic partnership. Thank you.
Christophe?
Yes. To answer the question, what does China want? It has to be, we have to ask the question to the Chinese, can you be a bit more specific on? Sorry? Can you be a bit more specific on what you request and what you're asking for?
How does, if China wants oil and gas from the South China Sea, how does it want to get it?
They have to be polite first. They have to ask for polite. No, the nine-dash line issue is not sustainable. I think it's a bad start for China and to start discussions. And this is what I call, as I mentioned in my paper, saying it's the policy of fait accompli. What they should abide by the recognized international rules and start discussion by being specific and justify their requests. Of course, as you said, they want the oil and gas resources. They need a lot, so they want to put a grab on it. To succeed in doing that, as I said, they should start bilateral or trilateral discussions to have, as you successfully did in Norway, in North Europe, and we've seen the same happening in other places in the world, joint developments and put aside the sovereignty issue and discuss very specifically business, economical development, fishery and everything. And there's room for that. They can be successful in doing so. The issue also, our political issue of the proeminence of the states in the region is also important. It's something China does not want. They are today recognized as a major economical country in the world. They want to have their room also and play the role they want to play, not only economical-wise, but also political-wise, geopolitical-wise, and so on.
Professor Sato.
Thank you. Regarding East China Sea issues, I'd like to say one thing. We cannot debate on sovereignty issues. Legally, we never admit Chinese claim on Senkaku Islands. But Chinese side says shelving in 1978. It means in the future we'll begin debate on sovereignty issues. We cannot accept it. Also, maybe one thing Chinese side misunderstand is 2012 nationalization of the Senkaku. Nationalization meaning stop the discussion, also stop the activity on Senkaku at the Japanese side. Meaning we would like to cool down the situation. But the Chinese side misunderstood it as nationalization would be a play up of the situations. Maybe we need more communication with each other. Thank you.
Let me then just offer a few of my own answers to Leszek Brzezinski's question. First, I think that China does not know exactly what it wants. I think there are many views in China and also many competing interests in China that are behind China's South China Sea policy. Then I think that China is in a way boxed up or imprisoned by the U-shaped line, which works it's in contradiction to China's interests because it's so unnegotiable and ambiguous and provokes others in ways that work against China's interests. And I think that the realization of this is growing in China, and that the kind of suggestion that Mark Valencia made in the South China Morning Post made a lot of sense also to a Chinese audience. And on this basis, China is likely to not just carry out a charm offensive, but actually gradually modify its South China Sea policy towards one that builds more clearly on the law of the sea, on international law. And there are a number of Chinese national interests that would point in that direction. And the first was the one that I was hoping to hear from Christoph Eck, that if China wants to really explore for oil in the South China Sea and develop joint ventures with other countries, it needs to clarify its claims so that you can know which areas are disputed and which are not. Because those that are not disputed would be open to joint ventures. The second reason is the one that we've heard from Professor Sato about the situation for the fish. If you are to protect the fish stocks for China and for the other countries in the future, you need cooperation, and cooperation can only be obtained through a cooperative spirit that also works in the direction of some agreement on maritime zones. And then from the point of view of strategy, the one that THAYER talked about, where you want to secure your flank and your submarine base in Hainan, and you want to prevent too much US interference in this region, best way to do that is through the good neighborly policy, where you agree with your neighbor states, and even are willing to give up some of what you think were yours, in order to gain the necessary strategic stability. And fourth, there is the national interest for China in its peaceful development, which is to have the necessary stability in the region to concentrate on its own internal domestic development, which also dictates a policy of good neighborliness that should be based on international law. I have been told that there was someone who has raised their hands on a row further back, and I didn't see. Now I see your hand stretching up here. So please remember to introduce yourself, and if there were more people behind here, I will notice it. Note down. Better mic, please.
Thank you very much. Such an important issue, it takes 2 mics for me to be heard. Good morning, I'm Adina Kamarudin from Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Malaysia. I would like to ask one question to Mr. Christopher Ek on the paper that you wrote, which mentioned on the, I may not be able to pronounce this right, Svalbard Treaty, and if it could be used as an example for the South China Sea as a precedent to look at. I would like you, if you can, to elaborate on the matter of demilitarization in that area, in the area that you mentioned, and its application in South China Sea. And also, are there any security arrangement in the area that you mentioned, which is under Svalbard Treaty? And secondly, I would just like to make a statement that for Malaysia, our official position is that we believe in peaceful negotiation in settlement, peaceful settlement of dispute, be it through dialogue or negotiation. And Philippines' action of going to arbitration is in pursuance with its national interests and as a sovereign state. For Malaysia, let's not forget, Singapore won Batu Putih, we won Sepadan Ligitan. So in a way, it could never be said never that Malaysia would go to arbitration again. The road may be open in the future, but not now. But Malaysia is no stranger to the international judicial process. Thank you.
Thank you. Christoph. Yes, we can discuss this while we're treating.
We'll share it with Stein. I mentioned this example but there are others. But this one is of interest for the region. There were maybe less historical and nationalist problems at stake. But it was quite complex. It took a while to be discussed. It took a while to be discussed. So it was the question of claimed sea between several countries. And I will go to the end, and the treaty roughly says that they've agreed on how to economically develop the region and the sea. Norway agreed also to give up some sovereignty over the region. They also agreed to have a demilitarized region, so no military activity, no aggression, nothing. So it helped and it enabled the countries, the surrounding countries, to have an economical activity in the sea, to develop oil and gas research together. And Norway didn't give up its sovereignty on the sea, but it accepted to have a reduced sovereignty when it came to some issues like taxation, environmental issues, and so on. So it's a quite interesting precedent that you could be worked on for ASEAN countries. So how, if you want to reach a solution to develop in the interest of all the countries, because you cannot have a solution and an agreement if everybody is not happy about the solution. But you're right. You were right of mentioning it because it's an interesting precedent, and could be of use to sort out the South Asia Sea issue. But Stein can add a as he lived, I did not say he lived the discussions, but he is in the region and knows by heart what the Svalbard Treaty is about.
No, I actually don't. I know a lot more about the South China Sea than I know about Norwegian interests, but at least I know that the Svalbard Treaty is about land. It's not about sea. It's about the Svalbard Islands, and they are under Norwegian sovereignty, but it's a kind of curtailed sovereignty because other countries also have the right to exploit resources on the islands. So there has been Soviet and later Russian station there, not run jointly with Norway, but an independently run by Russia, but on a territory where there is Norwegian sovereignty. The status of the surrounding sea and continental shelf is contested. So that's not part of the treaty. If this were to, I think it might be useful for people in around the South China Sea to look at the Svalbard Treaty and see whatever one could take from it. But it would not be relevant to the maritime zones in the South China Sea. It would be interesting, perhaps, for the Spratly Islands themselves, if one agreed that they could be under the sovereignty of one country, but open to exploitation by others. But perhaps it would be more realistic, as will be suggested by one of the later speakers at this conference, to build a regionally managed nature park there.
Yeah.
Next, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Hai Dang Wu. I'm from the EC Institute of the Diplomacy Academy of Vietnam. I would like to have a question to Dr. Valencia. It's actually both a question and a comment. In your opinion, don't you think that it is also in China's interest to support the arbitration? And that because of two reasons. First, from a legal perspective, I think that international awards and decisions always provide a basis for further negotiations, and China insists on negotiations. And the second reason for that is, you mentioned in your comment that big powers in the world always play down international institutions, international law. Isn't it an opportunity for China to show that it is a responsible player which play up international tribunals, international arbitration? Thank you.
This was for Mark Valencia, right? Yes. So, Mark, could it actually be in China's interest that the arbitral tribunal decides that the case is under its jurisdiction? Because it could come up with a solution that would allow China to get beyond certain obstacles to a more realistic approach to the South China Sea. Is that correct as an interpretation of your question?
Yes, and I mean that should China support the process?
But we know that it doesn't support it. But it could it still be in China's interest, although it doesn't openly support it?
Right. Thank you.
Mark, China has refused to participate in the arbitration. Could it still be in China's national interest that the arbitral tribunal find this to be within its jurisdiction, so it comes up with a verdict or a view that would help China get beyond this problem of defining the U-shaped line?
Well, an international loss and embarrassment is a little hard to imagine being in a country's interest. Perhaps you're right in the long term, but as I pointed out in the Nicaragua case against the United States didn't see it that way. And as John Mersheimer has said, I don't understand, he doesn't understand why we should expect China to be any different than any other rising power in history in terms of both in general and specific. It obviously wants to rewrite rules and practice that are in its interest, just like powers have done for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So no, I mean, it's a convoluted argument, and no, I don't think China would see it, perceive it to be in its interest.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yang Hui Song from Academia Sinica, Taiwan. I want to raise one point about the main part of the arbitration case is related to the U-shaped lines. And it's come to the question of the map in 1948. In June this year, the president of the Chinese National Institute of South China Sea Studies, President Wu Sichun, he mentioned that in Washington, D.C., that the outcome of the research of the legal nature of the night-shaped line will be released probably by the end of this year. But he said that last year as well. But the difficulty is this map was drawn by the, that time, 1947, 1948, as February released. So it's very complicated to explain, to clarify the legal meaning of that U-shaped line. Now comes to the question of the arbitration case. The gentleman, just our friend from Vietnam, asked a question about the need to negotiate or dialogue. Now my question is related to the 2002 DOC. So in that DOC, one of the commitments was made between China and ASEAN member states is to enter into bilateral negotiation. So that's the one political commitment. Now that political commitment comes to the international principle of the good faith. Now the question I'm going to ask is the following. Are we sure that we run out of the possibility for bilateral or multilateral consultation or negotiations? Now, given the fact that right now China is going to talk about the consultation on the COC. So my worry is about the possibility of opening the Pandora's box if the arbitration case proceeds before given time for the governments concerned to clarify the legal meaning of the U-shaped line. So my question, again, is related to the possibility of asking, for example, the Philippine government to withdraw. Is it possible to withdraw that arbitration case in the interest of peaceful development, in the interest of promoting ASEAN unity, and in the interest of developing bilateral relationship between the Philippines and China? Thank you.
Mark, I suppose that in your introduction today, you did not suggest that China should sit passively and wait for the arbitral tribunal to come up with a result, but instead China should clarify certain issues so that it would allow the Philippines to withdraw the case. Make the arbitral tribunal unnecessary in a way by resolving it through its own initiative. Is that right? That's correct. Mm-hmm. And that's a little bit what Song Yun-wei suggests as well, isn't it? Yes? You are nodding. Okay. Carl, please.
I have a footnote that I'd like to add. On the 9th of July, last year, before all the problems over the joint communique occurred that night, ASEAN unanimously agreed to propose elements of a regional code of conduct that contained two dispute settlement mechanisms. The first was the ASEAN High Council under the Treaty of Amity and Cooperation, and the second was under UNCLOS, which specifically mentioned the arbitral tribunal. The only error the Philippines has committed, as I said, was not to consult in advance, which had been with its fellow ASEAN countries before lodging this claim, because it does affect regional unity. But I think certainly the Philippines, from 1995 with Mischief Reef up until last year, could argue how long are consultations to occur? Like a piece of string? Are they endless? Or if the other side is not negotiating or talking in good faith, to go to the arbitral tribunal. So the Philippines undertook what already ASEAN had unanimously agreed a nation could do.
Thank you very much. I have the question.
This is Hashim Jalal.
Hashim Jalal, yeah, from Indonesia. First, regarding the possible intervention by non-claimants to the South China Sea and by other third parties that have interest in the South China Sea within the context of arbitration. First, who and how do we determine these parties? Is anyone free to say, I am a party and I am interested parties? Second, does it involve or lead to obligation by the non-claimants to be bound by the decision of the arbitration because they already intervened in the case? The third, do those countries which are not in the South China Sea but signed declaration of conduct with China also need to express their legal standing on this issue? In conclusion is, would the intervention by third parties, whoever they are, complicate the issues or make it easier for future relationship? Thank you.
Is there someone in the room who feels you're ready to answer this, please? Remember to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Chair. I'm Dung from the International Law Faculty from DAV Viet Nam. And actually, I have a comment rather than an answer to his question. I'm wondering why in his presentation, Professor Mark Valencia seems to pay too much attention on the political implication of possible outcome of arbitration, in the way that any option, possible outcome may be, may be having negative influence into international relations. From my point of view, the issue, the case, is consisted of different issues. Actually, in the statement of claims of the Philippines, there are 13 points in the case. And in case if arbitration doesn't find that it has jurisdiction regarding one issue, the U-shaped line, for example, doesn't mean that it is a failure for the arbitration itself and for international law in general. And that's why my question to Valencia is, to Mark Valencia, is whether the jurisdiction of the arbitration in regarding to other issues may somehow gain back the role of international law. And the second point is, even though if the arbitration doesn't find that it has jurisdiction over some issues, it is because international law is made by states, and it is the product of the states. So there is no question about whether it is a failure, but it is what the states want from international law. And as related to the U-shaped line in general, to politicians, does it matter how arbitration reason their decision? Does it make sense in the case if arbitration doesn't find that it has jurisdiction? Does it mean something to politicians the way it reasons its decision? And as related to the questions from from the distinguishing diplomat from Indonesia, my view is that arbitration as the nature of arbitration is to limit to the maximum the intervention of third parties as well as effects on third parties. That's why I don't think that it is likely that third parties can intervene into the arbitration. However, and in principle, decisions, the judgment, the decision of arbitrations is binding only upon member states who are involved. But I have to admit that since the arbitration touches upon very crucial issues of the South China Sea dispute, especially the U-shaped line and some features in the South China Sea, which have been the object of claims of many states. So it will have some effects, how outcome may be. But what I suggest is that in case if countries find that it has interest or rights impaired by the decision, it may make a notification to the arbitration clarifying its position and interest. And that is my suggestion.
Well, I just want to, first of all, clarify that while I find myself listed as U.S., that's true. I live in the U.S. I'm a U.S. citizen, but I sure as heck don't represent the U.S. position on this or many other matters, and there are people in the room who would confirm that.
Yes.
Secondly, I'll come back to your comment in a moment, but Hashim asks, as usual, the key questions. I mean, this needs to be researched. I don't think there's a quick answer to any one of those. My inclination would be that it would complicate matters because I see this issue as fraught with politics and political maneuvering and manipulation. My comment to the lady is, you know, this is a difference in philosophy. I've heard you speak before, and you clearly support the Harvard view of international law, that international law exists in some kind of vacuum as an ideal. It's unaffected and uninvolved and does not affect politics. I don't happen to agree with that view, but I'm an international relationist, not a lawyer. And there is another school of thought, there are many, but that says, as I said in my paper, that international law is the arms of politics. And when you can't achieve something politically, then you use international law to try to achieve your ends. We'll just have to agree to disagree on that philosophically.
I think it's just fitting that we end this session with Mark Valencia's comment on the relationship between law and politics. We will certainly have a chance to return to that subject in later panels as well. The program says that this panel ends at 11 o'clock. It's now 2 minutes to 11. And the program also says that there will now be a 10-minute photo session and then a 20-minute break, so that we will assemble again here in this room at 11:30. Are there any instructions for the photo session? Perhaps before you give that, we will offer an applause to the speakers.